Right. Welcome, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us today for this session. My name is Jenna Groman. I'm the Director of Global Communities of Practice at the Sabin Vaccine Institute, working with the Boost community. And it's my pleasure to welcome you to this session today, Social Listening Strategies and Traps, which is a session of the Behavioral Science Network. As we give everyone a few more moments to join, please take a moment to share your name and where you're joining from in the chat window today. You can engage in dialogue with your peers, ask questions of the panelists through the chat throughout today's session. Please also, you can use the reactions button to raise your hand if you'd like to ask a question live during the Q&A at the end. We will have time to answer your questions and hear from you as well. If you're able to put your video on, if you are speaking live, we would appreciate that. Our presenters today will be on video, but we understand the bandwidth concerns as well. So feel free to do whatever is easiest and best facilitates your participation today. The Behavioral Science Network is a community of social and behavior experts and immunization professionals. And our work is to really explore how to apply behavioral science tools and approaches to the delivery of immunization activities. If you are not already a member of the Behavioral Science Network, please join us on the Boost community. And as part of this network, you'll receive resources and tools about how behavioral science approaches have been adapted and implemented to address specific immunization challenges. You can connect with peers and experts to share learnings on what's working for you and ask questions as well as to how to apply some of the approaches and tools to your work. You'll also access skill building seminars and other sessions such as this one to help explore different approaches and tools and learn about their application to your work. With that, it is my pleasure to introduce today's speakers, Sarah Francis and Drew Bernard from Upswell, and I will hand it over to them. Thank you.
Thanks, Jenna. We are so excited to be here. Again, I'm Sarah with Upswell, and I am going to share my screen. It's always a little bit nerve-wracking when the person who's supposed to be sharing her screen doesn't work out. Okay, so Drew, can you see my screen?
I can. It's great.
Perfect.
Welcome, everyone. We're very glad to be here.
Great. All right. So Drew and I are going to walk through for the next 40 or so minutes an overview of social listening, some strategies, and some things to watch out for. And then we'd love to open it up for a discussion. And we can all learn together as we explore ideas around social listening. So for an overview of what we're going to talk about today, we're going to look at all of the top social listening tools, and there is a plethora of tools out there, so we are just scratching the surface. Then we're going to look at some traps and some pitfalls to watch out for. And then from Drew and I's point of view, a different approach that can really empower you to use social media to actually inform your research and your campaigns and avoid those traps and pitfalls. And then we'll have a question and answer. Okay, so here we go on the social listening tools. So first, before we look at each tool, let's define social listening. And oftentimes we lump these two definitions together, and it's really important to separate them out, right? First, you have social media monitoring, and then you have social listening. When you think about social listening, like most things, most technology tools, they come first from the corporate sector. So social media monitoring comes from brands monitoring their brand mentions, right? So if someone mentions General Electric and says my General Electric, toaster does not work, immediately someone at General Electric Communications can see that and respond. So that's social media monitoring. So you look for your organization's name or maybe a few keywords on key social channels. So One is monitoring and the other is social listening. So that's oftentimes it involves artificial intelligence or an algorithm to focus on overall trends and patterns, right? So you're looking at, kind of what is happening on social and looking at a volume scale instead of the monitoring, which is one person says my toaster didn't work. Drew, do you have anything else you want to add on this definition?
No, I would just say that both of these can be incredibly interesting and powerful. And I do want to say at any point, feel free to put in comments, questions in the chat as we're going here. But both monitoring and sort of like, it's like more like the finger on the pulse kind of thing, tracking the things that matter most to you, your brand, your keywords, your hashtags, things like that. Is interesting. And then, but that social listening piece is where we can, from a behavioral science standpoint, that's the thing that we often look to is it's this idea of, well, what are people talking about and how do we understand the audience? So that social listening piece that Sarah's talking about is, I think, the thing that that we think about from a behavior change standpoint, often almost more so, at least myself.
So every single social listening tool describes itself in a very similar way to this, right? It says, you can listen across all of these channels. The number varies, but often it's 30 plus or a huge number of channels, including social media, the messaging, the chat, even review sites, right? So it can go, beyond what we think of as like social media as Twitter and Facebook or Instagram. So social listening tools, say that they can give you everything. And
I'm going to jump in really quick, Sarah, because
Yeah.
the first question out of the gate is an absolutely fantastic question. And that is, does social listening need to be quantitative? And I absolutely love that question. So I hold tight. You're going to hear us talk more about this, but the long story short is absolutely. And that's where the challenges come in. And that's where sort of some of the pitfalls come in, is you really have to think about what that quantitative, what you're listening to from a quantitative standpoint.
Yeah, that's a
Sorry,
great
go ahead,
question.
Sarah.
Yeah, definitely. So here are a few of our favorite social listening tools. I divided them into 3 categories. So on the left side of your screen, you really have what is the enterprise or more expensive social listening tools. So there's Khoros, there's Meltwater. Meltwater actually comes originally from traditional press. So they have a huge database of press contacts that they keep regularly updated, and they've expanded into social media monitoring and listening. Salesforce Social Studio, if you all remember, it used to be a separate company, Radeon 6. So they're all kind of like merging. And then Sprinkler. All of these most of these enterprise solutions also offer some more affordable packages as well. But these are really like the big, expensive. They have both interesting AI and then also humans to help you think about your social listening strategies. The middle of the column, some of these companies also offer enterprise solutions or more expensive packaging, and some of them offer even free ones. Talkwalker in the middle of your screen, that's that's one that UNICEF uses a lot. I like it as well. Sprout Social and Hootsuite both allow you to do some monitoring and some social listening and also schedule all your posts. And then at the far right, Social Mention, if you just Google that, and I think we have all of the links in this deck so you can explore all of them here. Social Mention, you don't have to do anything, you don't have to pay for anything. You can just put in a keyword in this site and it'll spit out what's happening with that keyword. But it's quick and free, and it's a little bit questionable because you don't, and we'll get into this further, you don't know what data any of these and any social listening company is using. And that brings us to the traps and pitfalls of social listening that we would love for you to watch out for, and is really something that we're going to be exploring throughout this presentation. So the number one trap to avoid is assuming you are listening to your key audience, right? So if you want to do either, well, for brand monitoring, you're looking for everything, but if you are doing social listening and you want to look at a keyword like COVID-19 vaccines in a specific country because you're really interested in moving young women one step closer to the COVID-19 vaccine, and then you break out your big expensive social listening tool, let's say you're using like a Khoros. If you are assuming you are listening to your key audience, you need to rethink that assumption. And the ways to rethink that assumption, and we're going to explore all of these in the next section as well, but some key things to think about is, one, you have to understand if your key audience is even on social. So thinking about, are these people active on what channel? So are young women active on WhatsApp? Are they active on Facebook or Instagram? Do they have cell phones? Are they using TikTok? And why are they engaging with the topic that you are listening to? Is COVID-19 even part of the conversation? And how large is this engaged audience, right? So are you only listening to a small subset? And so once you have a key understanding of who your audiences are, then you have to think about, okay, so if my young female audience is on WhatsApp, is WhatsApp one of the channels I'm listening to using my social listening tool? Drew, what are your thoughts here?
Yeah, I think this is of the mistakes that we see happen. Mistakes the wrong word. It's like
I just think of it as a trap, not a mistake. Like
exactly, it's a trap. That's a great way to look at it. And one of the things that we see quite often is we see when you glean an insight that's unusual. I mean, I'm gonna equate this to the content that spreads on social media. You know, when you see something that's really unique and really stands out and resonates with you, it can often take an outsized sort of impact or have an outsized impact on your work. So really but you really have to peel the onion. Anytime you see an insight, or anytime you pick up something new in using the social media tool, it's really important to ask a bunch of questions. The question these questions around who is it that's saying this is critical. We're doing some work right now in Abidjan, and to Sarah's point, if we were trying to work with middle-aged women, and we were listening to gleaning insights from social media activity in Abidjan, we would not be learning anything about middle-aged women and their thoughts on COVID, because it's all younger men on the platforms that we're working on. The other thing that I'll bring up, and I think we talk a little bit about this in the next slide, but is it's critical to understand why are these people engaging with the topic that you're listening.
Let's talk about that one in just a second. Yeah. But first, let's talk about the social channels. So the majority of the data that any social listening tool, on anyone that we showed on an earlier slide, the majority of the data is Twitter data. That's the first question you need to ask before you enter in any contract with any social listening firm, is where are they getting their data from? And I would say, Drew, it's like 70% of their data is from Twitter data.
Often even more than that. So Twitter, and you have to think about it in the context of where can they get the data? And Twitter has some of the most open, what people call pipes, the most open access and sort of the widest pipes for getting data. And so what often I do see happen on a number of tools is they'll say we listen to Twitter and Facebook and TikTok and WhatsApp. They'll list this whole slew of platforms that they listen to. And in reality, if you really dig into their data, you'll find that the vast majority of their actual data that they are pulling in insights from is from Twitter. And we'll talk a little bit more about why that's a challenge, but people use different platforms for different reasons, and people use Twitter for a specific reason. And so it's important to understand where the data is coming from. And some tools, even sort of many, I would even say, go so far as to say many of the tools almost kind of blur. You can't tell where the data is coming from. Some do a pretty good job of identifying this came from this platform versus that platform. But it is really important to think about and understand that the majority of content is typically coming from Twitter.
Yeah, and no tool has access to private Facebook post data and never has, right? So if I share something on Facebook with my friends, no tool is going to see that. And that private post, the post, that I share with my friends, is often the most important post, the post that you want to see, right? Or you want to hear what's happening on WhatsApp, because that's a huge platform, and you want to know what's happening in those neighborhood safety groups. But unfortunately, or fortunately, no tool has access to WhatsApp, right? It's all encrypted data. So really thinking about where your audiences are and what channels you have access to listening to is two key points in figuring out this social listening puzzle.
And so to the point about Facebook private data, so there's two sides. What Sarah's talking about there is private data means when you send a message to someone, if your privacy settings inside Facebook are set to say that this content should only be seen by these several people, or I have my privacy settings restricted quite down quite far, those types of things. The other type of content on Facebook is called public data, and it is theoretically available. However, Facebook does not provide the same kind of pipes, as I mentioned before, that Twitter does. So actually the very, very few, if any, I don't think any of the social listening tools have any kind of really big pipe access to Facebook public data either. So typically social listening tools they might monitor comments within a post. They may be able to do some things where they're scraping. Anybody who says they really have deep access to Facebook data is probably scraping, which is not actually legal. Or again, it goes against Facebook's terms of service, and they risk getting their whole tool shut down. So very few entities, credible entities, are even trying to do even the public data from Facebook. So both the lack of access to Facebook data and WhatsApp data often make the social listening tools, frankly, not useful for much of the work that we do in the health sector. I'll just say that, having worked inside Facebook and having had access to interesting public data from inside Facebook, and also worked with Twitter data and other things, I can say that this is probably the biggest weakness of the social listening landscape, is the lack of access to arguably the most important platforms for our audiences that we work with. So just to call out there, I think this is probably some of the biggest weaknesses and the biggest challenges that kind of keep those tools from really being.
And that holds true for Instagram, and TikTok is still emerging with a lot of these social listening tools as well. So it just becomes really important for you to ask the questions about what social listening channels each tool has access to. And the second key trap to avoid, and we only have two, is to avoid listening to the wrong conversation, and to think about how you can listen to the right conversation, or how you can kind of listen around your topic to get insights for both your programs and your communications campaigns. So there's two ways to avoid this listening to the wrong conversation. The first is thinking about what keywords should you be looking for. So a really good example here is that oftentimes in public health, we can be really a little too jargony, right? We'll have like the alphabet soup of public health, or we'll have really scientific names for things instead of leaning into how people talk on social media or chat with their friends, right? When they'll have formal terms like just straight, when you were talking about breastfeeding, just saying breastfeeding. Whereas, if you're looking on social media, people can use slang terms often like milk vampires, right? Or thinking about what types of languages you should be looking at, like perhaps even though English is the main language in Nigeria, perhaps you should be looking and thinking about Pidgin or Hausa, so that you are actually, you are looking at words and keywords in the language people are using on social. So for example, in India, oftentimes, people will post in either English or Hindi, but a lot of times, especially when you're reaching out to young people or looking for how they're talking about things, they'll use a combination of English and Hindi, Hinglish, so they mash everything together. So, and then thinking about, are there adjacent topics you should be looking for, right? One thing I think about all the time is we were trying to run a campaign to increase motivation for people to wash their hands. So the organization wanted to think of, look at hand washing, but no one's talking about hand washing on social media. So thinking about the adjacent topics you can be looking for. And then the question is thinking about keywords, and should you be looking for these keywords? Perhaps your audience is talking around your issue. So one example here is that if you are thinking about how people are thinking about a national disaster like a flood, people aren't saying the flood has impacted me doing X, Y, or Z. They're saying, I can't find any pet food, or I can't find clean water. So thinking about not using the keyword flood, but thinking about that's the state everyone's in. So thinking about what's one step beyond that, and one way you can think around that. Drew, I know you have a lot of thoughts on this topic.
Yeah, I think that last point about understanding that many of the topics that you're, like COVID is a great example, right? Over the last couple of years, listening for COVID was almost redundant. If you're trying to understand an audience, if you're trying to listen to understand from a behavioral science standpoint, who is the audience? What are the things that matter to people? As Sarah was talking about with flooding, I think it was Brazil, Sarah, when we first stumbled upon this reality. We were doing some analysis to understand during this huge flooding season, and we're trying to figure out this. It's a long story. I won't get into the why and the how, but in this particular case, we were trying to understand what types of things should the government be doing to really support people. And at first, it was obvious we're going to listen to flood-oriented words, and pretty soon we realized actually that's not what really matters. And we began to really shift the energy toward the things that were people concerned about during a flood. And we were finding things like pets, people worrying about their pets, or people worrying about. So it's all these sort of adjacent things that are even more interesting. This is also a really important to come back to that the question about, is all social media quantitative, and does it need to be quantitative? And I would argue that yes, it does. If you're trying to understand how a large audience is thinking about something, you really have to stop and think. And this is the case for monitoring, I would argue also, in terms of, are you really only looking at 10 voices, right? Is there 50 or even 1,000 voices amongst a population of 2 million? Is a relatively small number. So you really have to be thinking about it. And I think back to the what words you're listening for. If you're listening for a word like breastfeeding, for instance, and you're thinking about how do we move men to be supportive of breastfeeding, chances are that you're not going to be hearing from men. Men are not talking about breastfeeding. So, if you want to understand, well, how do we better understand men in order to design a campaign that will, to make them more supportive of breastfeeding, then maybe what we should be doing is stepping back and just better understanding this target audience broadly. And we'll talk about this in a minute. But understanding what is, who's the audience that is talking about it, and then and what terms, like who uses that term, right? Who's the audience? If you're using jargon, sort of health jargon terms that you're monitoring for, chances are you're probably picking up conversation from people or signal from people who are also health jargony people, right? You may actually be listening to the health sector. We've seen that happen numerous times where people are actually listening to, in a way, themselves. And when you see an insight from a population that looks just like you, it seems logical. Oh, of course, that's what I thought. And it isn't until you can step away and say, no, let's look at some other keywords. Another example that I remember running into one of the first time that we ran into this is we were doing some work around heavy metals in water, in drinking water, which has huge health effects. And so the keywords that are often used are heavy metal. Well, in the West, in the United States, we have a whole genre of music called heavy metal. That's just like this really driving hard music. And we couldn't pick up any signal when we used the word heavy metal. It polluted the entire, sort of social listening experience, because we were getting all of these, what people call headbangers, like really, really hardcore. Anyway, so you just have to really be thinking strategically about what you're listening, what keywords you're looking for, and the kind of insights that you're hoping to glean from those. Sorry, so you can.
Oh no, that was a great example.
Right along.
So now we've talked about our two tracks, and there's only two to avoid. So let's step back and think about a different approach. So when I think about the first step that you need to take when you're thinking about a social listening project is power mapping. And you all know this. This is something as public health professionals and behavioral scientists, you do all of the time, right? So oftentimes you've already done some power mapping when you're thinking about your intervention. So working with program staff is really key here. But using all of that research and all of that deep thinking you've done for your intervention is something that you should also do when you are thinking about social listening. So the key questions that you need to kind of glean from the power mapping and from all of the strategy work that you've done for this intervention is to think about whose behavior we are trying to change, right? So who's the key target audience? And just like avoiding those traps, right? Is this an audience on social media? And if so, what platforms do they use? So if it's not an audience that's on social media, perhaps it's not an audience that you can listen to, but you could listen to a different audience to think about how you would design programs to a different audience that could be an influencer of this audience. So a way to think about that is that if you are trying to increase motivation to increase breastfeeding in India, thinking about listening to or thinking about what their husbands are talking about on social media, and thinking about how you can design a campaign that way. So thinking about what channel, super important. And then how do they engage on social? What language do they use? This definitely is not the language of the government or the economy or business, right? You need to understand the language of social. You also need to understand how long people spend on those platforms, right? Are they just moving in and out really quickly? Are they spending a lot of time? What devices are they using to get on top of it? And what types of content does this audience engage with most, right? Is it videos? That's really hard to do a social listening project around. Is it images? Is it quick text messages? So thinking all of that through is really important. And those are things that you can just oftentimes pull out of all of the power mapping that you've done for this intervention so far. And the second question to ask is, who are the key influencers, right? If you are trying to change the behavior of seniors in a certain location, right, you want to increase COVID-19 vaccines among seniors, thinking about their grandchildren as influencers or their sons and daughters, and thinking about those types of platforms, or thinking about who you can listen to, like should you be looking at pop stars or like in the Nollywood or Bollywood. And then also looking at the influencers, just like you look at your key audience, the language that they use, the time that they spend, and the types of content. Drew, do you have any other questions that you would add to power mapping?
Yeah, I mean, this is a little bit of an adjacent topic within the context of power mapping, but I think, and so there's some risk here of muddying the waters, but this power mapping thing is really important because it really gives you that audience. This is making very clear sense of, who is it you're trying to listen to? Who is it that really is most important to you? And then the other side of that coin is, and are they on these platforms that you're listening to? The one thing I would add to this is, why are they there? Being thoughtful about why. What is the intent of the person that is taking the action that results in you being able to listen to them? And this, I think, is probably, I would actually say, one of the most important things to just constantly be thinking about is, why did the person who shared this share it? There's a old saying in the database world that garbage in, garbage out. And the same is true in the social listening sense, that you have to understand the intent of the user when they shared it on social media. As an example of this, when someone goes to Google, we know their intent. They're looking for an answer to something, right? They're looking something up. Their intent is to seek information either for themselves or to help someone else or something like that. On different social media platforms, different people come for different reasons. And thinking about it in the sense of, like, why is your audience that you're wanting to listen to, why are they present here or there? And this is where the Twitter thing becomes problematic at times. Is there's a lot of people on Twitter who are there actually to influence, right? That's why that platform exists to the degree it does, is people look at it as a place where I can come and I can kind of have a larger amount of influence, kind of outsized influence relative to if I call someone on the phone. If I call a media reporter on the phone, I won't have as much influence often as if I do on Twitter. So Twitter is a place where people come almost with a professional hat, many people, with the intent of influencing, with the intent of being heard, to influence the discussion, to influence things. That's very different, say, than WhatsApp or even than Facebook, where people come to interact with each other at a personal, interpersonal level. The intent is different. So, but being thoughtful about, why is your audience, if your audience is active on a platform with this topic, asking the question, why? What is their intent whenever they do something? Because everything that someone does on social media, they do for a reason. Anyway, I'll stop there.
So that's such a good point, Drew, right? Because I would never share baby photographs of my kid on Twitter, but I would share baby photographs on Facebook with my close circle of friends, right? Because they maybe not live in my hometown and they want to see what's happening in my family. But that's thinking about how each platform is used is just as important about thinking about if your audience is on that platform. So here's an example of how you would map out these questions if you were power mapping. So you have your key audience, you have the social channels that they are. I really recommend just asking program staff if to include these questions on any types of surveys, so that you can get a sense of building out how you would, or if you can, run some social listening around that. So here's just a sense of how you can do social listening on each channel that we were talking about, moving away from those social listening tools, right? So this is a free way to kind of think about what you can learn on each channel. So this is kind of a eyesore of a slide, but I know that Jenna and folks at this community are going to be sending out these slides. So you have Facebook. The tools that you can use are, so you can do a general search. There's also a great tool inside of Facebook called Audience Insights. And then you can learn your audience size. You can learn the demographics of the audience that's on Facebook and Instagram. So you can actually see if your audience is on this channel. You can look at top content on key pages that this audience may follow or engage with, right? So that's just a great way to do some basic research before you do any other social listening tools. Instagram, the hashtag search in Instagram is awesome. You can immediately see how many times a hashtag is used and also the top public posts. So it's a great way to explore the topics, especially because people, mash up their own hashtags. It's a great thing to look at. WhatsApp, unfortunately, you can't really do any research. There are some third-party WhatsApp group search tools, but I wouldn't put a lot of stock in that. Twitter, you can search for anything. It's fairly open, as Drew was talking about, but again, it's a really small audience that you're generally looking at. And a way to get a sense of the audience size is you don't have to spend any money on Twitter ads, but you can use the Twitter ad tool to actually do some research. LinkedIn, same thing. Use the ads tool as though you were going to spend money on ads to think about your ads. And then you can also use the search tool to look at public posts by keyword, and it's filterable by country, which is really nice. And YouTube, really similar search tool, and then there's some third-party tools.
Hey, Sarah, I know that we're going to go quickly through these, and we're running.
Yeah, we are almost over time, Drew. So go quick.
It just dawned on me, though. I think it's really important for everybody also to keep in mind that any kind of ad campaign, anything that money is being spent on, is also going to, whether you're using the free tools or the paid tools. If there are campaigns out there spending money, whether it's your own campaign or another campaign, that is going to shift the conversation, right? If there's a campaign running on a given topic, you're probably going to see more of the target audience that campaign is trying to move. So just be thoughtful about the public. Remember, this is only public data on the free side and the paid side, the paid tools, listening tools front. Sorry, go ahead, Sarah.
Yeah, and we are going to have a series of trainings later on in the summer that's available to you, where we're going to go through all of these tools and all of these subject matter in depth. So stay tuned for that. Hold on to your hats while we run through the rest of the slides, and know that we'll have more in-depth sessions on all of these tools later on in the summer. So here's what audience insights looks like inside the Meta tools, where you can look at both Facebook and Instagram. You can see your audience breakdown by age and gender, interest, and country. For Facebook has a great tool. If you run a Facebook page, you can then secretly watch some other pages and see their top content. So if I was running a breastfeeding campaign, I would secretly watch a bunch of formula companies to see what they're posting and to see the types of engagement they get. And the formula companies won't even know you're following them, right? So it's a great little spyglass that you get inside of Facebook. This is what it looks like if you follow one of those formula companies. Here's the LinkedIn search. This is what the LinkedIn search looks like. Here's the Twitter general search. You can look at the trends. You can look at top hashtags. Here's the Twitter ads tool where you can look at demographics. I highly recommend pretending you're an advertiser to see what your audience size is. Here's, if you haven't gone to hashtags.org to explore Twitter hashtags, I totally recommend it. You can see the estimated tweets per hour, and you can see the prolific users. And again, thinking about why someone on Twitter is really important. And then the other thing to do in your new, kind of way of thinking about and way to approach social listening, right? We start with the power mapping. We think about how we can listen, especially how we can explore on each channel without using a social listening tool first. And then you can also listen to your community. So do some post-comment analysis, especially if you are running a large campaign, if you are using any types of Facebook ads or Instagram ads. Monitoring and engaging and cataloging the comments that you receive can be really informative, not only for the campaign that you are currently running, but for any future campaign you're doing. There are hundreds of free tools that you can use to pull your comments into Excel that then you can use or any other format for analyzing it. And they're all very legal and wonderful to use. And
yeah,
here's
and
a really
on that front.
Oh, go ahead, Drew.
Oh, sorry. Oh, I was just going to jump in and talk a little bit about this one. But even before this, thinking about analyzing comments. So as Sarah says, there's all kinds of tools out there that allow you to go to a post even on Facebook, which is the one we tend to use. Because the reason people share on Facebook is it's as themselves with their real friends. And so we tend to like the comment data in Facebook quite a bit. And it's accessible. You can also get access to the comments of any post that you're monitoring. So we did some analysis early during the COVID vaccine development process in support of some work with UNICEF, and we were going to the UNICEF page and downloading thousands and thousands of comments, and then running them through some analysis tools to better understand the anti-vaxxer conversation, what types of things were really taking off, what were kind of the good and the bad. So that those comment export types of things, listening, you can do that not just on your own posts, but on any post. So if you see, content that is just like on the formula companies, if there's a really deep thread of conversation happening around formula, you can then go and export that and analyze it as well. So this was a great example. This is this wonderful organization called Shoe Jazz, and what they were doing. So a lot of the work that we end up getting involved with, it ends up being very ad driven. And there are different ways of measuring the impact of a campaign when you're using ads for a bunch of different reasons. I won't get into it. The Shoe Jazz team, one of the things they have is this incredibly powerful micro-influencer network, and which is incredible to be able to activate this huge network of young people. The challenge is it makes it hard to measure, right? Because you've got 4,500 different people sharing all over the place. You kind of can't harness that and measure that in kind of the same kind of way we might if we were running a campaign on a single page or something like that. But what they did is they have a very active community on their Facebook pages in this particular case. Also, I think on Twitter to some degree. But in Kenya and Tanzania, they were able to actually then monitor the change in the conversation within their own community. And that was actually how they measured, did we move the dial? They also did some things, they did some live events to vaccination events, and they were also able to capture on the ground data of the number of people who were coming because of the campaign, which was even more powerful in a lot of ways. But the fact that they were simply able to measure the conversation within their own community before and after the campaign allowed them to see that this huge network of influencers that they had mobilized was really moving the conversation and shifting sort of social norms. So this is an example of where they were actually using this kind of social listening that we often use to glean insights for behavior change campaigns. They were actually using that same thing to measure, do we think we made a difference? Did we change the conversation? Did we change hearts and minds? And they did that actually through analyzing comments, which I thought was really, really interesting.
So Drew, we are actually
yes.
at time, and I want to make sure we have
just
enough time for conversations as well. So I'm going to fly really quickly through. You can also do social media surveys to listen to your community. So it's not just listening to comments. You can actually ask people. There's on-platform survey tools, which can give you a really high response rate. They're either free or they're really inexpensive, less than $1 a response. And then but the problem is that if you use an on-platform survey, you're really limited on number of questions. Here's an eye chart that shows you, and you'll have access to all these slides, but it'll show you how each platform, what you get for each, what you can do on each one. And then there's also, these are just samples of all the polls that you can run on a whole bunch of different platforms. And then you can also use ads on any platform to drive people to an online survey tool where you can ask as many questions as you want. It's very affordable, often less than $2 a response. And we've found that it can just be a great way to quickly gather data much faster than on the ground surveys. And it can allow you a bit more flexibility in research. And here's some examples of driving ads to an off-platform survey.
Huge call out that this survey approach, everyone, this is our favorite approach to really getting deep data, because you can also ask information about the audience, so you know who you're actually listening to when you're surveying them on these offline tools. So if you work with an academic, you're definitely going to end up going this route, because you can just get so much richer data about the audience you're listening to and questions.
And there's a great question about ethical clearance. Yes, if you are doing any kind of research project and paired with an academic, we highly recommend getting an IRB and making sure that everything is reviewed by an ethical committee. And also you need permission, right? Making sure that you have a really clear statement that people are agreeing to when they first get to your survey, making sure that people understand how their data is being used and is really important. And also all of these surveys can be done anonymously, right? So you can, we've had a lot of success working with IRB boards and moving these surveys through them. All right, we made it, Drew. We are just 4 minutes over.
I'm so sorry, yes.
A record by our time. Normally, Drew and I can talk forever about this topic. Now it's time. We would love to hear from you, and we would love to open it up for some questions and answers.
And while we're waiting for that, I'm just going to add a little bit. The question about what tools we recommend for this, it really is all over the board. We're happy. If you would like to just email us, we can send you back some ideas. If you're technical enough and you can run some just use JavaScript yourself, then it's completely free and you can do it on your own. Sarah is a huge geek, and so that's her approach that she uses. I tend to use, there's a very simple online sort of scraping tool for comments that, again, is totally legal and it's not entirely free, but there's a variety of ways you can do that. So we're happy to send you some information on that. Any questions? This is usually where these things get more fun, because you all are living this in the real world. And Sarah and I, we've been seeing it across for so long in so many ways that we can get a little geeky. So please feel free to ask any questions. Where to get?
The ethical clearance for listening to Twitter too, that's only for if you are doing a survey. So if you are moving people from ads to an off-platform survey, you can't get ethical clearance for just listening or using a social listening tool.
And you don't need it. And we've worked with a lot of folks over the years who have asked that question. Wait, should we be doing an IRB for this campaign on Facebook or Twitter or wherever, or using if you use internal polling tools from these platforms, you don't get a ton of data. There may be some cases where you would get personally identifiable information. Anytime you're getting that kind of PII, you likely would need an IRB. You definitely can get, if you want, through the external surveys. That's where we end up getting IRBs when we're running surveys.
Thanks, Drew and Sarah. And I just want to echo again, please feel free to put more questions in the chat, or also raise your hands if you'd like to ask any questions live. I think it would also be really interesting to hear from any of the participants as to how they've used, if they've used social listening in the past and how they've done it. Sybil, I see your hand raised. Go ahead and unmute.
Thanks. Hi, thank you for a great presentation. I'd just like to come back to the qualitative, quantitative question and hear your views on this, because I've been thinking a lot about this. I've been working with someone on extracting data from Twitter in Sweden, looking at COVID-19 vaccine sentiments. And we didn't get so much data, actually. So we had this long debate and thinking around whether we could analyze the data qualitatively using a sort of deductive approach, because we hope to get more data. And you're saying it's quantitative, but I'm thinking if we're thinking about generalizing results, it's very hard to generalize the findings anyway, because we're not quite sure who we're listening to. So why is qual, in your opinion, then not a good alternative?
This is a really hot topic for me. The main reason, especially, let's think about COVID, right? Who's talking about COVID online right now? Who's really active on Twitter? Oftentimes, you're thinking about how do we glean insights for a behavioral campaign that's going to allow us to reach the audience that's maybe unmotivated, that's maybe a little apprehensive, that isn't that interested, right? They're the holdouts. They're not, they're apathetic, maybe, right? Almost by definition, if a person is apathetic about COVID, they're not talking about it on social media. So what you're picking up most likely on Twitter is people who are absolutely go vaccinate, and people who are vaccines are going to kill you and cause autism, right? So you're picking up this conversation at the edges, but what you're very likely missing very directly is everybody in the middle. And those people on the outside, we've been talking for years, right? We're so noisy on social media, the pro and the negative, and we're just beating each other up. It's this constant thing. And it's a lot of the reason that the people in the middle aren't engaging, because they know if they do, they're going to get attacked by this person or whatever. So I would, depending on the audience you're trying to reach, if you're trying to reach an audience, and I've done some work specifically with Twitter, where our goal was to actually move the dial on people in one of those outside camps. If you're trying to reach or treat or engage with someone that's in that active audience, that's active in the topic, then it's great. Most of the time, what we see is people are trying to glean insights from these platforms for an audience that is like, hey, I'm not even touching that topic on social media, because as soon as I bring it up, everybody starts jumping down my throat. So you really have to be thinking about, again, who is it that's engaging in that topic? Why are they engaging? And can you use the insights that you'll glean from that audience for to improve your campaign for a different audience?
Who is on that channel? So I haven't done any campaigns in Sweden, and I do not know the breakdown on social media channels in Sweden, but I would think about, and I know the African continent really well, and South America. And when I'm looking at Twitter data, oftentimes it's the staff of government officials. Government officials themselves and reporters are really outnumber anyone else than the general population of Twitter. So you would be a great place to look at what are people in the halls of power thinking about and listening to, and what are they listening to when they think about that topic around COVID. So I would also look into who's on Twitter when you look at any data there.
And the other thing that I would consider is I would also look at understanding, if you know that you're, and I'm totally making this up as you know, but let's say that you were you're gonna run a campaign trying to reach women to increase vaccination amongst an age group. The other thing I would look at is I'd say, you know what if we spun up a little survey on any survey tool, and we targeted those people with ads. We spent $500 in ads. Targeting those people on Facebook. We know that we're narrowing it in. We're going to only reach, women between these ages, maybe, in these places. And we're going to actually survey them, and we're going to ask 500 of them. We're going to work to get 500 people to give us the information that we specifically want. And we know it's that audience because that's the only people we're targeting with our ads. So oftentimes that approach can be faster, and you just get a different kind of, if you're going to do more of a qualitative analysis, that kind of gives you both sometimes quantity, right? You could get 500 in 3 days. So it gives you the quantitative, but it also gives you the qualitative, where you can go in and you can ask questions that allow you to kind of dig into in a little bit more deeply.
And Drew, Vivian asked a question around proper social listening without purchasing any of the paid social listening platforms. And I definitely think you can do some of the more interesting social listening, and especially social listening that can have really inform your campaigns and your programs if you do the free social listening. If you do, and I'm sorry about moving.
I would agree. The thing about using these companies' own tools is they have access to their own data in a way that the external tools don't. And so I really think it can take a little bit more work sometimes. Some of them are not as user-friendly. They're not, they're not as exciting, and they're not designed to be quite as much sort of dopamine, exciting kinds of interfaces. But the insights that you can glean when you know what you're looking for and how to use them is, I would say, is better than just about all of the paid ones. That's my humble opinion.
And you know where the data is coming from, which is really great.
Yeah.
So I would do any of these free tools, and also combined with either an on-platform or ads to a survey to really understand what people think about a certain topic, and to inform your campaigns.
Thank you, Drew and Sarah. I want to say thank you for your presentation today and also answering all of these questions. I do want to encourage participants, you can continue sharing your questions as well. I'm sure Drew and Sarah would be happy to continue answering and helping as you move along in your work. But before we close out quickly, I just want to share a few things. The first is that if you have additional questions or other experiences you'd like to share or challenges that you might be facing, please join the conversation online on the Behavioral Science Network. You can ask any questions, talk about what you've learned, explore more resources. Please also take our survey that will be shared in the chat box. We want to hear from you about your responses to today's session, what you've learned, and what else you would like to learn in the future, so that we can make sure we are designing sessions to meet that. Before we close out today, I also want to say, to share that we have our next event next week on June 21st, which is on human-centered design for tailoring immunization programs. So we'll be engaging on the learning group on the Behavioral Science Network online over the next week to prepare for this session. And we hope you're able to join us then as well. And so once again, I just want to say a huge thank you to Drew and Sarah for sharing your expertise today and all of these strategies and tips that people can take and apply to their own work. And thank you to all of our participants for joining today and asking all of your insightful questions. And we really look forward to hearing how you take some of this and use it in your work. So please just continue the conversation. And we look forward to speaking with you next time. We hope you all have a great day.
Thanks, Jenna. Bye, everyone.